Right, okay, what I thought I'd talk about today is the shipwreck, the Sepia, which was a three-masted iron sailing barque that wrecked en route to Fremantle, just off here actually, at Carnac Island, about 3 kilometres west of Carnac. It was carrying what is termed a general cargo, so essentially a whole range of goods and building supplies which were considered necessary for a growing colony, the Swan River colony here in Fremantle and Perth. I did some excavations on it a few years ago. In particular, we came across a number of items that have helped us understand a little bit more about the consumer society that was happening here in the 19th century, a little bit about what colonists want in their lives, what was necessary for a safe and staple life here. And so what we've been doing is actually examining some of the cargo items from the hull of the shipwreck. It's interesting because the vessel is made out of iron. When it's actually wrecked and on the seabed, it's actually retained much of its three-dimensionality. So particularly in the lower hold, where often the beer was kept, you've still got quite good preservation of objects and cases of objects in situ, so in their original place where they were when the ship wrecked in 1898. So a little bit about some of the objects that we have to show you. First of all, because we're dealing with the late 19th century, there's an awful lot of documentation that is still available. What we've got here is what we call a bill of lading. It's just basically a part of a very long shipping documentation. This one would have been carried on the vessel and also on another vessel sent out to the colony in case something happened to the cargo. And what it does is just gives you an overview of what was being shipped. In this case, we've got 70 cases of bottled beer, a very, very popular import into Western Australia in the 1890s. The vessel, which it came by, the person, the consigner. So this is actually a firm called E&J Burke of Dublin. So that helps us get a better idea about what was on board of the vessel. And then there's lots of different information here written in the column. This is consigned to Lionel Sampson and Sons here in Fremantle. So that gives us our first sort of starting point in learning about what the vessel, the Sepia, would have been carrying. In terms of some of the objects, I thought I'd show you two things, the upper end of the scale and the lower end of the scale. Firstly, often people think with shipwrecks off our coast, because it's such a dynamic environment, that we actually don't have much remaining. But as I said before, because you've got this three-dimensionality left on an iron shipwreck, you can often get things preserved. A good example of this are these unique objects. We've got a set of this glass. It's called Satin Glass. It was very popular in the late 19th century. It used to appear in the great exhibitions in London and Europe. What it is, it's actually a dipped glass with applique here, or prunts, they're called, on the side. Now, we can actually look at this style and compare it with stuff that was being manufactured in the UK at the time. And we know that this style was being made in the areas of Stourbridge and Birmingham. In fact, we can find almost identical examples. So that's one end of the scale. This stuff is actually valued at well over $5,000, so it's actually quite a highly prized item today, as it probably would have been in the 19th century. Perhaps some of the more mundane and perhaps more interesting things for Australians is obviously the beer. Beer was transported again in cases and bottles like this, and in the excavation we actually found these bottles with the corks and the seals on top still in situ, laying in the boxes, which would have straw dunnage along the side. So the things were so preserved as they would have been when they were sent out. Unfortunately, a lot of the paper labels, they're all gone. They've all been rotted. So what we are left with to identify the product is what we call the tin-coated lead seal that sits on top. Here's an example of one here. If you have a look, you've got the neck of the bottle, and inside you've still got the cork. Then over the top, that would have been tied on with a bit of copper wire. And then sitting on the top would be the tin-coated lead seal. And on top of that is an imprint or stamp that actually either showed you the bottler or the actual brewer of the substance inside. And we've got lots of these from various maritime contexts. They come from shipwrecks, as well as also from the long jetty here in Fremantle, just out the front of the museum. So they're just basically a range of sort of bits of metal. You may not find them as interesting objects, but in fact these ones are what show you the most information. Something like this, if you can actually get in to read or identify the mark on it. In this case we're looking at a globe. We can identify that as a trademark of a local Scottish brewer. So that can tell us what sort of product is being imported, and in fact is probably the first evidence of our boutique trade that comes into Fremantle and Western Australia. Because of course at the time the beer here was really bad. They actually called it things like shy poo. The water was terrible. They just did not have the techniques that they had in the UK, which demanded the really clean waters of Burton-on-Trent. Now we've got the Fremantle Swan area, which just didn't deliver the same quality. So there was still a reliance very much on this material coming over from Britain. Now today, of course, we've reversed that with brewers like little creatures who get out the frontier. So now you can find our beers manufactured here, all across Europe and of course in London. So that's just sort of a little overview of some of the objects, ranging from the more finer materials through to the more mundane, but also very essential. Because again, if water's no good, beer is your next sort of thing you had. I think for most Australians today, it's still a really important commodity.